It was June 14th, 1969, a day that started out like in any other. The sun was high, birds were singing, and the air in the Great Smoky Mountains was thick with the earthy scent of pine and moss. I was with my family, enjoying what should have been a peaceful Father's Day outing. The Martin family, like many others, had come to this lush national park for a little getaway, a chance to breathe in the fresh mountain air and disconnect from the stresses of life. But that was before Dennis disappeared. Dennis Martin, my 6-year-old son, was a spirited boy. He had the energy of a dozen children and the curiosity to match. He and his older brother, along with a couple of friends, had been playing nearby. They'd been sneaking around the campsite, making plans to pull a prank on me and my wife. The boys had the mischievous glint in their eyes, and I couldn't help but chuckle as they ran off, giggling. It wasn't long before the sound of their laughter faded into the trees. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, they were just being boys. Then it happened. Dennis, the smallest of the group, had lagged behind as the others sprinted off. I watched him for a moment, then turned back to my wife, who was unpacking our things. I'd only looked away for a second, maybe two, but when I turned back, Dennis was gone. No sign of him, no shout of laughter, no little feet running through the underbrush, just silence. My heart skipped a beat. I called out for him, expecting him to pop out from behind a tree, his face lit with that mischievous grin, but nothing. I shouted again, louder this time, panic creeping into my voice. Still nothing. I rushed over to where I had last seen him, but the dense underbrush and towering trees offered no clues. I called for him again, my voice breaking with fear. "Dennis!" The word echoed, swallowed by the vastness of the forest. It was as if the mountains themselves were swallowing my son whole. I began to search, frantically. My heart pounded in my chest as I combed through the brush, pushing aside branches, calling his name. It didn't make sense. Dennis couldn't have wandered off that far. The area wasn't remote. There were other campers, other families just a short distance away. Someone must have seen something, but no one had. I remember the first ranger who arrived. He looked calm, maybe too calm for the situation, as though he had seen something like this before. He told me not to worry, that the boy was probably just lost and would turn up soon. But the words didn't bring me comfort. How could Dennis just disappear like that? He wasn't the type of child to wander off. He loved the outdoors, but he always stayed close. Something wasn't right. Soon, more rangers arrived, then volunteers, and finally, the National Guard. It felt like the whole world had come to the Smoky Mountains to find Dennis. The search was exhaustive. Hundreds of people combing through the forest, looking under every rock and boulder, every fallen tree. But nothing. No sign of Dennis. No footprints, no clothing, no trace of him at all. As hours turned into days, my hope began to fade. The forest was vast, but it wasn't a wilderness so wild that a child couldn't be found. There had to be something to explain how my son had disappeared without a trace. Days later, strange things started happening. There were reports of sightings, people claiming to have seen a boy matching Dennis's description. In the days following his disappearance, some said they saw a disheveled child in the woods, not far from the search area. I was filled with a mixture of hope and dread. Could it be him? Could my son have been wandering out there, lost and scared? But when the search parties revisited the spots where these sightings were reported, they found nothing. It was as if Dennis had never existed. Some people speculated that maybe an animal had taken him, perhaps a bear or something more sinister. The Smoky Mountains were home to all sorts of wild creatures, But none of them could explain the total lack of evidence. No broken branches, no animal tracks, no fur. It was as if Dennis had simply vanished from the earth. Then came the theories, the ones that sent chills crawling down my spine. Some whispered that something more unnatural had taken him, something that lurked in the shadows of the forest. I didn't want to believe it, but the longer Dennis stayed missing, the more I started to entertain the possibility. People spoke in hushed tones about the strange disappearances in national parks, how children seem to vanish without a trace in certain places. They called it the missing 411, cases of people vanishing in the wild, sometimes without any explanation, and often with strange details that made no sense. Could Dennis be another victim? I had to know. So I kept searching, even after the official search was called off. Days turned into weeks, and still there was no sign of my boy. The only thing left were the whispers, the reports of sightings that grew more and more distant from the truth, like fragments of a dream. What happened to Dennis? I still don't know. The authorities never found anything, and neither did I. I've spent years wondering if maybe something out there, deep in the Smoky Mountains, claimed him. Something that waits in the shadows, hidden from the eyes of those who are too blind to see it. The mystery of his disappearance has never been solved, but there's one thing I know for sure. I can never forget that look on his face, the way he disappeared behind that rock, his laughter fading into the distance. Somewhere out there, in the heart of those dark ancient mountains, the answer waits. And maybe, just maybe, it will stay hidden forever. I'll never forget the day Stacy disappeared. It was a road trip like any other. She and I, just two kids in love, heading out to see the world. I had my truck packed, our favorite playlist queued up, and a sense of freedom that only comes when you're young and in the middle of nowhere. The open highway stretched before us like a ribbon, and the Arizona sun glinted off the dust. It was the kind of adventure we had talked about for months, and in that moment, nothing could have gone wrong. But something did. It all started when my truck sputtered to a stop. A mechanical failure, nothing too strange in the grand scheme of things. But out here, in the middle of the desert, it felt like a bad omen. We were at least a few miles from the nearest gas station, so I told Stacy to stay with the car while I went for help. She didn't seem worried, just the usual light-hearted teasing about me and my old truck as I grabbed my phone, keys, and started walking down the road. I figured I'd be back in an hour at most. It seemed like a safe enough place. There were other cars on the road, and the sun was high, baking the dry earth with the kind of warmth that made you think everything would be fine. But as I walked, I started to feel it, a creeping sense that something wasn't right. The longer I walked, the more uneasy I became. The distance between me and Stacy felt like a vast chasm, though it was only a few miles. The Arizona desert had a strange way of making the world feel both enormous and suffocating at once. I tried calling her a few times just to check in, but my calls went straight to voicemail. It was a little weird, but I chalked it up to bad reception. She had that old phone, the kind that could barely hold a charge, let alone get a signal in the middle of nowhere. I wasn't worried, at least, not at first. Hours passed. The sun dipped lower in the sky. By the time I reached the gas station, I realized that I had been gone for far longer than I'd intended. I filled up a canister of gas, grabbed some water, and began heading back. The sky had darkened, turning the world into shades of purple and orange. The air was cooler, but a knot was beginning to form in my stomach. Something felt off. I couldn't shake it. When I finally saw the familiar outline of the car in the distance, I breathed a sigh of relief. But that relief quickly turned to confusion. Stacy wasn't in the car. I called her name, first softly, then louder, the panic creeping in with every unanswered shout. The silence was thick, oppressive. The car was exactly where I had left it. Doors unlocked, no sign of a struggle, no sign of anything unusual. Her purse was sitting on the passenger seat, everything in its place, like she had simply vanished. I checked my phone again, hoping for a sign of life, but there was nothing. No text, no call. I tried calling again, over and over, but the phone remained dead. A wave of unease crashed over me. Where could she have gone? Why would she leave the car? That's when the unease turned to dread. As the minutes stretched into an hour, then 2, I realized that something was terribly wrong. It wasn't just the absence of Stacy. It was the way everything seemed. Too quiet. No cars passing by, no sounds of wildlife. The world felt empty, barren. I should have felt relief when I reached the car. After all, she was supposed to be here, safe. But instead, I was terrified. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath. I tried to make sense of it. Maybe she had wandered off, but to where? And why hadn't anyone stopped to help? The road was busy enough, or at least it should have been. I wasn't the only one who had seen her car, and yet there was nothing. No one. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, hours had passed, and they were as confused as I was. There were no signs of foul play, no footprints, no evidence of a struggle. No one had seen anything. It was as though she had just walked into thin air. The next few days were a blur of empty searches, dead-end leads, and long nights staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together a puzzle that didn't make sense. I couldn't stop thinking about the strange emptiness I had felt when I returned to the car. It was like the desert itself had swallowed her whole. But it wasn't just that. There were whispers. People said they had seen her in other towns, hundreds of miles away. Sometimes she was walking down the street. Other times, she was sitting at a diner, a faraway look in her eyes. But every sighting was unconfirmed. A blurry image in a parking lot. A glimpse of her through a window. It felt like a ghost story that wouldn't die. Some thought I was losing my mind, but I knew what I had seen. Or, more accurately, what I hadn't seen. Then came the news reports. They claimed that other people had disappeared in similar ways, not just in Arizona, but across the country. Young people, alone in remote areas, who vanished without a trace. No struggle, no sign of a fight, just gone. They called it Missing 411, a name that sent a chill down my spine every time I heard it. The more I read, the more it made sense. Too much sense. Stacy's case was just one of many. People talked about abductions, serial killers, even strange government experiments, but nothing ever seemed to fit. The more I tried to find answers, the deeper the mystery became. I heard theories about people who vanished without a trace, taken by something or someone unseen. I'm still haunted by that moment when I saw the empty car. When I called her name, the wind seemed to answer instead of her. Something took her. I don't know what. I don't know why. But I know Stacy Anaris is not the first, and she won't be the last. The desert may look peaceful, but beneath the sun-drenched beauty lies something far darker. And it waits. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. My family and I had driven up to the Salmon River in Idaho, a place known for its beauty and serenity. The towering pines, the soft hum of the river, and the smell of damp earth. It felt like the perfect escape from the chaos of everyday life. I could still hear the crackle of the campfire and the laughter of my wife, Maria, as she and Jared, our 5-year-old son, roasted marshmallows under the fading light of the evening. It was July 19th, 2019, A perfect summer evening in the mountains. Jared had been full of energy, as usual. The boy never seemed to tire. He loved exploring, even in places like this where the trees reached so high they seemed to touch the sky. He was just out of my sight for a moment, playing near the edge of the campsite. "I'll be right back," I told Maria as I grabbed a fishing rod and headed toward the riverbank. The water was calm, and the air had started to cool off. But when I returned to the campsite minutes later, everything changed. The fire was still crackling, but Jared wasn't there. Maria was standing by the tent, calling his name, her voice shaky. My heart sank. At first I thought he'd wandered off a bit further into the woods. I'd done the same thing at his age, after all. But this wasn't like before. "Jared, Jared," Maria's voice was rising now, panic threading through her words. "Where are you?" I forced myself to remain calm. He's probably just exploring. He couldn't have gone far. But as the minutes ticked by, I started to feel a cold knot of fear in my stomach. We called his name again and again. We ran through the woods, checking every shadow, every rock, every tree. We couldn't hear him. There was no answer. The sound of our voices in the dense forest was swallowed by the towering trees. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed him whole. We didn't waste any time. We contacted authorities, and soon the first responders arrived. Park rangers, search and rescue teams. They fanned out, calling Jared's name as they scoured the area, combing the dense underbrush and the steep ravines that surrounded the campsite. The helicopters arrived within hours, their blades roaring overhead as they scanned the forest below with infrared cameras. I don't remember how long we searched, or how long I stood frozen, waiting, hoping for someone to shout, "We found him!" But that moment never came. Instead, we were left with silence. Days passed. The search grew more desperate. They brought in search dogs, trained to track a scent. But the dogs were confused. They circled the campsite, sniffing the ground, their heads cocked to the side, as if something had disrupted their ability to follow the trail. They were disoriented. They couldn't pick up Jared's scent. It was as if the forest had swallowed him whole, leaving no trace behind. I remember one of the rangers, a grizzled man who had been working these woods for years, pulling me aside one night. His face was grim. "I've seen a lot of strange disappearances in these forests," he said, lowering his voice. "But this doesn't make sense. There's something wrong here. Something unnatural." I couldn't bring myself to ask what he meant. What did he think had happened to my son? The thought that Jared might have been abducted flitted through my mind, but I couldn't hold on to it. It was too horrifying to consider. Who would take a child in the middle of the night, in a place like this? Then came the inexplicable part. The strange clues, the things that didn't add up. Searchers found no footprints, not even a single boot print in the dirt, no sign of a struggle. No broken branches where he might have been dragged away. It was as if Jared had simply disappeared, as if the forest had swallowed him whole, without a trace. And yet there was a strange feeling in the air, a weight, an eerie silence that hung over the search teams. The deeper they went into the forest, the more unnerved they became. Some of them said they felt watched, as if something unseen was observing them from the shadows of the trees. One night, as the search grew more desperate, I stood alone by the riverbank, staring at the black water. I don't know why, but I felt like something was calling to me. There was a coldness in the air that hadn't been there before, a sense that the woods themselves were alive, watching. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But it didn't go away. It lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. Another week passed, and the authorities began to pull back. The helicopters stopped flying overhead. The dogs had returned to their handlers. The search had turned into a recovery mission. But I didn't want to give up. Jared had to be out there. He couldn't just vanish. The final twist came on the morning of the 4th week. A member of the search team, a young woman who had been working tirelessly, came to me with an unsettling report. She had found something, a small child-sized piece of clothing. It was just off the trail, near a rocky outcrop, but when they went back to retrieve it, it was gone. No sign of it anywhere. It was as if it had never been there at all. I wanted to scream, to shout into the trees, to demand answers from the forest itself. What had happened to my son? Where had he gone? The months have passed, but the questions still haunt me. There has been no trace of Jared, no word, no sign that he's still out there. I've replayed every moment in my mind 1,000 times. How could he have disappeared so quickly, so completely? What could possibly have happened to him? The wilderness, this vast, wild place that we thought we knew so well, had taken my son. And there are no answers. Maybe some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. But I can't help but feel that something unnatural happened that day in the forest. I'm not sure what it is, but I feel it in my bones. Something in those woods, something beyond our understanding, took Jared. And maybe, just maybe, it's still out there, waiting.